Peace and love, you beautiful miracles with a spiritual level of being. Nathan here from a spiritual level of being, and you have a spiritual level of being. And today we're going to be discussing the corruption of Scripture. Now, in the ancient past, there were several ancient Christian theologians, several ancient Christian priests, which were also powerful politicians in their own right, which would make copies and copies and retranslations of the New Testament Scripture, of which they would edit or remove certain parts they did not like. Now, sometimes there was also mistakes made, as there were also translation errors, and these translation errors would then partake in even more translation errors, as other scribes would also copy them. Now, the Bible has over 40 different authors, of which took place over different time periods and in different locations, and several of these authors did not like each other or get along with each other. Now, after the death of Jesus and his disciples, the Christian movements would go out and spread out, of which would produce their own Holy Scripture. Now, many of the ancient Christians would get along with each other and read each other's writings. Now, these scriptures would eventually lead into what became known as today non-canonical and canonical scriptures. Now, later writings and copyings of translations were restricted to only 4 Gospels, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, while the rest were rejected and forbidden to be retranslated. Now, because of this, these 4 Gospels were being copied and copied from each other, we now have the Gospel translations mostly the same. Now, before this, the ancient Christians did not really care who the author was, as it was the meaning of the Scripture itself. Now, the Gospel of John, of which was contributed to either Mary Magdalene or John, it wasn't until the church fathers decided to slap the name John onto it that it was considered the Gospel of John. Now, the very first complete Christian Bible, if you will, or Christian Codex, containing multiple different Christian scripture, was written by Marcion, who was considered a Gnostic Christian, or a type of Gnostic Christian, or even a Christian influenced by Gnosticism. Now, he rejected the Old Testament because he viewed it as corrupted. Now, he also rejected the Old Testament God as evil, jealous, and he couldn't have been the loving God that Jesus was speaking of, so he rejected Yahweh, as did many ancient Christians. Now, this was common amongst many ancient Christian groups. Now, some did also worship Yahweh. Some even viewed Jesus as Yahweh and his father being El. Now, it wasn't until Origen pointed out that there is only one God and that he is both good and just, that this idea was mostly removed, and he himself was later condemned by the church that he used to roll with. Now, St. Irenaeus of the 2nd century, these two figures were living around the same time. Now, he was an early day church father, and he was also a heresy hunter who wrote a book against heresies, which he condemned Gnostic Christians and other groups of Christians. Now, he restricted the Gospels to only 4 Gospels. As he said, there's only 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, he did also accept the writings of Paul. Now, the writings of Paul most likely weren't even written by Paul, and this belief of the Gospels being written by the actual disciples themselves, we now know this is not the case, but some preachers still continue to preach this, even though most of them know of which that these Gospels weren't actually written by the disciples themselves. Now, the goal of these priests and theologians that were writing their version of the Gospels, their goal was to be believed. So they would slap the names of the disciples of Jesus on, or the Apostle Paul, on their scriptures to claim that they were written by these people themselves. Now, this is why this belief that the Gospels were written by the disciples still continues today. Now, many Christians believe that the Bible is 100% perfect without error, but they themselves have not actually read the entire book, or they cherry pick their beliefs, and with this, without any form of reflection or questioning. Now, every gospel in the ancient past would have their own message, their own symbolic value, that every Christian would have their own interpretation of it. So they had their own messages. But these gospels were restricted and rejected to ultimately only leave us Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, this is because the church fathers at the time wanting to control the faith, to control the people, as they didn't want the common people to have a personal relationship with God, as it was outside of the church's influence. So peace and love, everyone. I love you all. Connect to one mind and soul. Namaste.